And we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 13. I've lost count. Anyways, whatever week this is, welcome. And we are going to be doing borders. So this is our Quilt Sampler 2022 sew along. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And if you like what you see, please click the little like button. YouTube loves it when we do that. So here we go. We finally got our quilt all together. I've seen some people post pictures of their quilts on beds. They're gorgeous. And let's add some borders. Some of the newer modern quilts don't have borders, but most of the older ones especially have some kind of border on it. And what it's going to do is help stabilize the edge of our quilt. With this one, you can see the piecing and stuff. We have tons of different seams. There's lots of stretch there. And we really want to make sure that our quilt lies nice and flat. And we're going to go over a lot of ways on how to do that a little bit later on. First off, we're going to talk about fabric selection, why I chose what I chose for my quilt. So my first little border here, I chose it to be the same fabric as my little set-in triangles here, and there was two reasons why. One is going to just stabilize my edge. It's going to give me that nice straight first border. But secondly, if any of my piecing was off in my little corners here, if any of my piecing was off, because I'm using the very same fabric, it's not going to show. So it's just going to hide any of the little imperfections on this pieced edge of our quilt. So that's always good. And then I just needed a little bit. I'm going by size. I wanted it to be whatever 70 it was. That I find is a nice. So I chose my borders accordingly. That being said, again, if you have a different reason for this quilt, there's no reason to take this one border, make it larger, maybe just leave that border. That's all. Add another border, add two borders, smaller, larger than what we say. It's your quilt, and you can decide on the borders. Sometimes I know if a quilt is in a book is showing there was 4.5 inch or a 5.5 inch border, I didn't have quite enough fabric left over, cut it down to 4.5. Nobody knew that my quilt was 2 inches smaller than what it was supposed to be said. Okay, so my last border. Here's where some color choices really come into effect. Whatever color I have on the outside of my quilt will pull that color out of my blocks. So there's a lot of choices that I could do for a final border. So there's and if I had that out farther, you would see that all of a sudden that large purple border will jump out of the quilt. So that one. Make sure you get to the mic as you can. Close to the mic as I can. Okay, put the mic here, and then I can actually put the fabric here. Does that work? Mm-hmm. Okay. So there is a blue. And again, I don't know if you can tell online or on the computer, but as soon as I put that fabric down, or even if I put it up more, you are now going to pull all that blue out of the quilt. So all of a sudden you have a blue quilt. The same would happen if I picked a peach. So you can, again, I don't know if it shows, if you could tell, if it was on a design wall, you would really be able to see the fabrics, how it works, reacts with the quilt. But if I had a peach on there, all of a sudden it's going to pull all those peaches out of my quilt. So I didn't want my quilt to be, all of those are great borders. It would work absolutely wonderful depending on what you wanted with your quilt. I didn't want I didn't want my quilt to be a specific color. I want them all to play nice in the pool. So that's why I chose this fabric. So because it's a cream background, it's not pulling a specific color, but in that, my blues, my greens, my peaches, it has a larger print, which is really great to use on a border because our pieces are going to be a bit bigger. So I think that's the one that I am going to use for my second border. I kind of like that. So that's my choice of fabric. So I've cut my strips according to what the pattern said. I cut 1.5 for my first ones and 3.5 for my second border. And we're going to start sewing them together. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. We're just going to move the camera in a little bit. So if you have vertigo, close your eyes for a minute and let us get situated. Did you turn your iron on? Oh, you did not. It's not even plugged in. Thanks, Tiff. Oh, I gotta change chair. This is the squeaky chair. I don't think you want me to be squeaking all video. Okay, so I have cut my border fabrics according to the pattern. Tiffany, when she put hers on her quilt, actually her fabric's a little bit wider. It was over 42 inches. She was cut only 6 strips. So that's why in the pattern you can see that I have 7 strips, or I have 7 or 8 strips, depending on how you join them and how fabric is. My fabric was actually 44 inches, and out of the 6 strips, I only have a few inches left. So I got away with it because it was a wide fabric. Awesome. So, old school quilt police. They always said that your borders should be sewn on a diagonal. I can show you a diagonal seam here. I have one. So it goes on a diagonal. They said that you were supposed to do that because that would make your seam less noticeable. Not so much anymore. And I think we fired all the quilt police because I do it both ways. I don't, but when it's a little border, I sew it on a diagonal, unless it's a striped fabric. If it's a striped fabric, if you tried to do a diagonal, you would see all the stripes that didn't line up. So I always do those straight. So the small border, we're going to sew on a diagonal, and we can do that in a couple ways. Here's a really good tip that nobody tells you.
So you're sewing all 6 pieces end to end?
I'm sewing all 6 pieces end to end. A lot of patterns, what they'll do is they'll take 2 pieces, sew them together for the sides, take 2 pieces, sew them together for the top and the bottom. That means you need 8 pieces. Your seam is going to be on the same place basically every time. What I like to do, especially with a larger quilt, I sew all my strips together all in one long row. Then I cut them to size for my quilt. It will stagger my seams so they're not noticeable. And sometimes I have to cut one less strip of fabric, which is always good. So when you sew, can I have the bolt of fabric there, Tiff, for a minute? I just need something that has, I don't know if this has a good direction.
Oh, that's so nice. Dorothy McPhail says, absolutely wonderful series, and I can't thank you enough for sharing so many hours with us. Thank you, Dorothy.
Oh, thank you. Can you go get something that has direction? Oh, actual video.
Okay.
Okay. So before Tiff's gone to find us a bolt of fabric. And what I want to talk about is the direction. Sometimes, depending on the print, we want always going in the same direction. And here's a good example. So all our bunnies, we want to make sure that they're going, when we sew our seams together, that our bunnies are all going to be right side up and not upside down. I don't want one strip one way, one strip the other. So other than looking at our fabric, which with something like this might be a little bit difficult to see, I have a tip that I've trained my brain to do, and I never have to think about the direction of it, whether it is a directional fabric. It's all going to always sew together properly. Fabrics have what I call a salvage and a not salvage. They both are salvage edges that have to be cut off. And so one of them is usually printed in white and it has printing on it. And the other one usually is the color of the fabric right to the edge. So I call this my salvage and my not salvage. If I always align my fabrics from salvage to not salvage and continually do that with my brain, all of my fabrics will always be in the same direction. Doesn't matter whether it's upside down or right side down. It's just the identical. So because I do this, I do it with all my borders and all my bindings, and I never have to think whether my fabric is directional. It's just when I'm sewing these long pieces together, I always sew my white salvage to my not white salvage. So we're going to sew that on a diagonal. Two methods. So I'm going to use the line of my mat to keep me a little bit straight. I am not going to cut my salvages off now because I'm going to help them. They're going to help me align my fabric. And I just want to save that step. So my first strip is going to go right sides up, horizontal. My second strip is going to go right sides down. And I am going to align it up with the edge of my salvage. And that's going to make sure that it stays nice and straight. So old school method. We're going to draw a line from corner to corner. And we're going to sew just a thread to the right of that line to make room for our seam fold over. So let's see how good I can do this. So I put my needle in the down position. I'm going to butt that up into where the seam is. I have my diagonal seam tape there, so I know this line is lined up. I am going to sew just to say that I'm hopefully on the right of that line. Before I cut my edges off, I want to open it up and make sure that it's going in the right direction. If I sewed in the wrong direction, it would fold on top of each other. Don't want to go there. So now that I know that it's proper on there, I can cut my salvage off. Actually, cut my corner off first and then those little dog ears. And I will press this seam to the side. And here's a good example of why I don't like this method. I actually sewed it a little bit crooked. And it also didn't sew at the beginning of my strip. That's probably part of it. Let's find a leader here. There we go. So you can see that I'm pretty good. This side's lined up. This one's just off because my line went a little bit crooked. I'm going to fudge this into my seam allowance, so I'm not going to worry about that. But if you have been one of the people that purchased this simple folded corner ruler, here's another great way to use that ruler. Nowhere does it say this in any of the instructions, or I don't think he ever even thought about using it this way, but I think it's really cool. So what I'm going to do again, I'm going to line my strip right side up, horizontal. My second strip, that's my salvage to my not salvage, is going to align wrong side up, right side's down at that 45-degree angle, and it's vertical. I'm too close to my sewing machine here.
It's a 90-degree angle.
90 degree, thank you. My math whiz. And then I'm going to take my folded corner, the same as what we were doing before when we were doing the folded corners. I want the flat of my ruler along the top of my strip. Is that good? I can't see. My solid line on my vertical strip. These borders are cut 1.5. So whatever that line is that whatever that measurement is. So it's 1.5. My 1.5 is on the bottom. My 1.5 is on the top. I can cut. I can, if I want to, I can just cut that little dog ear off now, or I don't even have to worry about that. I'll just leave that on, make life a little bit easier. Now I'm going to sew with that perfect 1/4 inch. So now when I open it up, I have a much better alignment with my strip. So again, I'm just going to press that to the side, and my strips are ready to go. Again, when I'm sewing, I also have on my one wide one here. It doesn't matter what size my strip is. I can sew this on a diagonal the way the Quilt Please said that we were going to do. But here's the thing. Salvage to not salvage. If I do this and I'm cutting all this fabric off, in my brain, that's wasteful. I really hate throwing that fabric out for no reason. So let's just sew this together.
The wider the border, the more waste.
The wider the border, the more waste, exactly. So I would sew this together with a straight seam, or anything that has a stripe. I'd always sew together with a straight seam. 2 ways to do that. Same way, salvage to not salvage, or the printed salvage to the not printed salvage. Line them up. I want to get rid of that salvage, so I can do it now or before I sew. If I wanted to do it now, all I'm going to do is line the edge of my ruler on and cut it off. If you didn't have the space to have your cutter, you want to do it now. I use these to line them up. I don't want to cut my salvages off ahead of time, because then I don't know what side was my salvage and what white salvage, what side was my printed salvage. So I have to leave them on until I go to sew. If I don't want to cut them off, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to sew with about a 3/4 or a 7/8 inch seam allowance. So most sewing machines have lines on their sewing machine. So this one has a 3/4, a 7/8, and a 1 inch. So it depends on how wide your salvage is. This one has a fairly narrow salvage, so I can get away with the 7/8 or 3/4. So I am just going to sew my 2 strips together, aligning the edge of my fabric up with that 3/4 inch mark. So I'm not looking at the needle, I'm looking at my fabric. So now that I have it sewn together, I can, if I didn't have a rotary cutter, I could just cut this off with my scissors. Or if I have my rotary cutter, I can cut my 1/4 inch. I've taken my salvage off. I'm good to go. And again, because it's a border, I'm just going to press it to the side. And now my wide border, my second border, is ready to go as well. So now we have to go back to the quilt and we have to talk about, oh, wait, before we do that, I can talk a little bit more about putting borders on the quilts. When we all started learning how to quilt, Eleanor Burns used to be the quilt in a day method. You would take your quilt, you would start sewing at the top of your quilt, and you would sew all the way to the bottom and hack off your border. Well, a lot of times when you do that, your border is going to be very, very wonky. It's going to add fullness. I have this table runner here that's a really great example. So I have a lot of seams on the edge. Some of this is actually even bias fabric. I wanted to prove to you that we don't just say this just because that's what we think, that it's actually a reason behind it. So if I sew at the top, so what I did with this border is I started sewing at the top, I got to the bottom, and I just hack this off. Looks good, right? Looks absolutely perfect. It's going to lay flat. I'm going to prove this to you. Let me just take this border off. What ends up happening is, I'm looking for my, there it is. What ends up happening is every time you hit a seam, it sort of opens up a little bit, or there's a little stretch and it opens up a little bit. So all of a sudden you have too much fabric on your border. If you have a quilt, and I have had quilts that have had 6 borders on the outside. So if my first border is too big, too wobbly, and I sew my second border on, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. What's going to end up happening is you are going to have a quilt that doesn't lie flat. Your border is going to be very wavy. You're going to take it to the long armor, or even my sister tried to do one by hand quilting at the one time. She couldn't get it in her frame. She didn't know what had happened, and that was her very first quilt that she did. And it was all because we just grabbed that border and sewed it on. And no one ever visually sees this. We tell you not to do that, but I want you to see this. It's just going to take me a second. I've even had quilts that have come in with the borders, interior borders, and it made the quilt all bubbly. I ended up having to take tucks in borders up to 1 inch that we had to literally fold it over just so it would lay flat. And it absolutely fantastic, beautiful quilts that now had a flaw. So the same with any part of quilting, putting a border deserves the extra work and care that putting the blocks together does. Okay, so here I've got the border off. And you did see that I hacked it off at the end, but I want you to see this. Here now. So I'm aligning it up at the right side. I am going down my quilt, going down to the end. And my border is about 1 inch too long. If this was a quilt that's 4 times this, all of a sudden, if you think about it, I have 4 inches of fabric that's squished up in my quilt that's got to go somewhere. And then if I do it again on another border and another border, all of a sudden my third border has like an extra 10 inches of fabric. It's never going to lie flat. So there's a couple ways, or a way that we can really make sure that this isn't going to happen. Let's go back over to the quilt. And I'm just going to ask Tiffany, the camera set up to check the if there's any questions. be humming something or something. Check and see if there's any questions. I just need my rotary cutter and my ruler.
Don't see any questions.
Alrighty. So, let's get these out of your way. I am going to tell you the proper way to do a quilt. There is a little bit of discrepancy always in our edges into our middle. Our middle is way more stable because of where it is in the middle than our edge that you can see can stretch quite a bit. So the real way to do it, can I have a tape measure, please, top drawer? Oh, thank you. So what we theoretically should do is this. We are going to measure our quilt about 6 inches in. And I have 69 inches. I'm going to measure through the middle. Which is 68 3/4. And I'm going to measure on this side, again, about 6 inches in. And I'm at 69 and just a little smidge. So the proper way, let me get back to the mic.
I guess our seam allowances are different because mine was 68.5.
Was it? I might have trimmed mine a little bit wider too. Who's to say? What was I saying now? Oh, okay. So the proper way to do this is we're supposed to find the average of those measurements. So I'd have to add those 3 measurements together and divide by 3. That's what I'm going to cut the border off. So many people hear this and I can't do math. I'm not going to do it. I don't want to do that. I'm just going to put them on. Please don't do that. At the very least, do it with my measurement. And this is where we're going to go. Visual line, whether it's a seam, if it's things that aren't on point. Here I've got a row of the blocks, and I'm going to use that for my border. So I'm going to take my border, and I am going to align it. So I'm using the points of those blocks. If you don't have a place big enough to run your whole quilt out, just take a pin it in place, and then we can go on and we can move our quilt. And then I can move my quilt and I can shift it. So I am actually doing the long side right now first. Most of the time, we always do the long sides first and then the short sides. And we continue that on with our other borders. Long side first and the short side. So I have my little cutting mat. Excuse my head. I am going to put this under here like that. And I am going to cut my border the size of my quilt. I'm going to scoot back over to the other edge. I made a mess of my border. I am going to align this one, right sides together, or right beside the other one, I mean. I can put my pin just to hold it in place. While I'm shifting, I am going to take this side. I am going to cut this flush with the edge of my quilt. And I'm using, like I said again, the center of my quilt because that's the most stable.
And you are lining up your ruler with the border in order to keep it straight?
Exactly. I've got the edge of my border with the edge of my ruler. My ruler is cutting it flush with the side of my quilt. Okay, so now I have my 2 borders. Because I'm putting straight borders on, I'm not mitering the corners. That's another whole lesson in itself. We use miters only when we have to, but we always put straight borders on. So I'm going to unpin these. And now I want to put these on the quilt. So if I just took this, that's the right way, started at the top, got to the bottom, it's going to be probably too short. What I want to do is mark my border and my quilt. So I'm going to take my border. I'm going to find the center point. I've got it on my wrist. Oh. I'm going to find the center point of my border, and you can finger press that and mark it, or mark it with a pin. I like using a pin because sometimes I lose the finger press. And I'm going to fold it one more time, and I'm going to find the quarters. So I've quartered my borders. I will do that on both. So I just finger pressed it so I can see where that goes. Pin and pin. So I've done that on my border. I'm going to do the identical thing on my quilt.
You do have a block in the center, so you can find that center.
Oh,
easy.
I got you. It's a wide block in the center, so there's my center. Sometimes I have a seam that runs down the center. I will definitely use that to keep me nice and straight. And I'm going to fold it again to find my quarters. There we go. So there we go. So I've got my quarters marked on my side. I would do both sides at the same time if this was in real time. I'm just going to do one today. I have my borders marked. So I'm going to find my center pin. I'm going to align it with that center pin. And I'll take the one pin out, use the one pin, and I will pin it to that spot. Aligning up my quarter. And also aligning up the edge of my quilt. I don't care what's happening in the center right yet. And I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Align up my edge. Align up my end. So now I want to add a few more pins. I'm going to take in between this, depending on how much fullness you have. Get this on the table here. Excuse me. I want to make sure that it fits properly. So again, remember I said that my edges are a lot of times going to be a little bit bigger. You can, I don't know if you can tell here, but as I'm holding this nicely, my border is nice and straight, but I have a little bit of fullness in my back. I want to make sure that that's distributed perfectly between the pins, and I want to make sure that it stays there. So I'm going to grab my two pins, and I'm just going to stretch it out and walk my finger into the center. And I'm probably going to put another pin here and another pin here. And I'm going to continue that on along the edge of my quilt. See, this one here seems fairly even. So I'm still going to pin it though. I want to make sure that any bulk, any fullness is distributed in between my pins. It's also going to help this strip to stay aligned to my quilt. This is one of the places that really wants to jiggle and wiggle when you're sewing them together. Sometimes the seam-aligned glue would be a great thing to use. This one has a lot of fullness on that piece. So it all depends on how, when I put those border blocks in, maybe I stretched one, maybe one of my seams was quite a little bit bigger.
But you would still quarter it with pins before using the seam align glue?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And my last quarter, and this one looks pretty good. If for some reason, if you were going along and looked at this and my top border on this one was a little bit bulky and the bottom border on this one was a little bit bulky in between the two pins, you can maybe adjust in between those two pins, but that center has to stay in the center. That end has to stay in the end. Just in case maybe you measured wrong, you can always double check that. So let's go back to the sewing machine and let's sew this border in place. Say hi to yourselves, everyone. Sorry about all the movement today, but it was the only way I could actually figure out how to do this. And because it's live, we can't pause and continue on. Oh,
And they probably heard none of that because the mic's over here.
yeah. Any questions?
Nope.
Okay, I just need a sip here. All right, here's one of the times where if you have a walking foot or this IDT, it's really great. It'll help keep our rows, our layers distributed nicely. And here's one of the times where we're going to get these feed dogs to help us out. So I'm just going to use my leader here. I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam. And remember my quilt had a little bit of fullness to it? I'm going to sew with that on the bottom. What that's going to do is as those feed dogs are pulling my fabric bottom, it's going to help feed that in between my pins. All right.
Especially if you don't have the IDT.
Especially if you don't have a walking foot and IDT. If you have the opportunity to sew with the needle down position, this is a great time to use it. I am just going to fix my settings here. This foot, when my needle goes down, my foot comes up. I'm just going to take that feature off right now because as I'm sewing, I want my presser foot to stay down and lock this in so I can adjust my fabric a little bit better. I forgot you could do that. And I forgot to tell you that. Okay, so I am concentrating only between these two pins. I have a little bit of fullness on the bottom, so I can actually roll this on my hand, give it a little tug, and make sure all that stays nice in between my two pins. Make sure my bottom seam was going in the right direction. Again, I'm going to sew up to the edge of my pin. Now I can take that off, and I'm going to concentrate on the next pin. If I'm getting any fullness, I'll show you on the next pin. Make sure that that's aligned up nicely. Because this is my join here, I've got a little bit of fullness. I do not want to take this pin out, just, let the fullness go down, because it would just go from pin to pin to pin to pin, and then all of a sudden it's too short at the end. So I really want to make sure that that's going to stay where it belongs. And I'm just looking for my purple thing. I thought I had it here. Is that what fell on the floor? No? No? Okay. I know I had it. I just had it. Okay. I can use a pin. There it is. Thank you, Tiffany. What would I do without you? So I have some fullness here. So I want to make sure that it's going to stay distributed. So I can use my purple thing and I can just keep this fullness going up on this side, keeping it where it's supposed to be. And now that I hit that pin, there's no fullness there at all. That's very common to happen when you have a bias or a diagonal seam. Right up to my pin. Again, I don't want this to shift, just peeking to make sure it's lined up. I know there's ladies that have come to class and they'll say, oh, I have my top done. I'm just going to sew my borders on today. And they're surprised that it takes them most of the day to sew those borders on properly. And, you know, the border deserves just as much care as the rest of the quilt. And you are going to be so much happier if it's a wall hanging. It's going to hang much straighter. The quilt's going to be much flatter. If you send them to a long armor, your long armor is going to be way happier because it's going to fit on her frame so much better because everything's nice and flat.
A lot of people say it's just a border, but a bad border can ruin a good quilt. And so you have to treat it like it's not just a border. That's what I find.
It's true. I had one quilt the one time that was absolutely stunning hand appliqued, but she wasn't familiar with putting borders on properly. So when she put them on, I ended up having to take tucks in the borders. And I actually sent one back home and explained how to put borders on right so she could fix it, because it was an absolutely stunning heirloom quality quilt, except for the borders. Gee, I think I'm running out of things to say.
Only took you 13 weeks.
I know. Just aligning that edge because it does want to shift. Here I'm coming to another bias seam. Let's see how this one works.
I do have a question for you. I accidentally pressed my seams open because that's what I do when I make binding, and that's just what where my head is at because of the size of the strips. Should I unpick those and fold them flat?
Not really. It's going to have a little bit more chance of maybe your batting will bleed through there, but because it's just a small seam, and also we're not going to be stitching in the ditch in that, so when it's long armed or when it's, you know, doing an overall whatever, it's going to catch that, so you'll be fine. When we're doing binding, we always press the seams open. We'll talk about that more next week.
We're doing a video next week, Stephen?
We're doing one more video. We're going to do a video on binding. Yes, I'm sorry, this quilt won't be done, but I will have some examples of binding and how to do the binding, how to attach. I'll show you a little bit by hand. I'll show you by machine. I don't know that I'd have enough time to do the other binding. We'll have to do another mini video later for magic binding or something like that. Okay, so this end was a little full on the bottom, so I want to make sure that I'm aware of that.
Martine said if you ran out of things to say, you can sing us a song.
Yeah, no. In my dare, I keep thinking of the Jeopardy theme song, but I think that's copyrighted, so I really can't do that one. So there, I'm at the end of my quilt. I have to lift my foot. My edge is still perfectly aligned. Any fullness, you can't even see that there's fullness in there because everything went really nice. So now what I would do is do the border exactly the same on the other long side. Then I am going to press these seams to the...
I have my two sides sewn on.
Do
if
you?
Want
Perfect. I will use your quilt.
And I don't have my short side sewn on yet. So
Is that what you were pinning? So there's Tiff's quilt. Now she decided that she wanted a little bit wider border here. So she cut, what did you cut? A 2-inch, yeah. 2-inch border. So hers is going to be a little bit wider than mine. But again, that was her own preference. So she has pressed the seams towards the border. That's the way it's going to want to go anyway. So let's not fight it. And then we're going to take our second border. This is already cut. So what we're going to do, again, we are now going to measure from this border to this border so our seam goes on the top. Finding that point through, aligning it up, and cutting it to size. Treating it again exactly the way we did before. We're going to find our center. We're going to find our center. I don't think that pin's supposed to be in that spot. Nope.
I think that was at the 30-inch mark.
Okay.
Because I measured mine and divided by 3.
I'm going to find my quarters. Yeah, so whatever way that you do your quilt, whether you're just going to do this no math measurement or whether you're going to take the 3 measurements, add them together and divide by 3 to find your average, you're going to put the borders on the very same way. So again, I've quartered that. And I'm going to quarter this as well. I can see that this is going to be the center of my block, but I do want to quarter it right from the edge of the border that we put on. So here's our center, which just happened to be right in that point of that triangle, which is a good thing because Tiff, that means it was square. I'm going to quarter it again. This one's not going to be in the quarter of a quilt or anything because it's, or at the edge of a quilt because of that border that we have on. So if it doesn't line up on a point, it's not supposed to. No, we are not open. We are live. We're live. I'm sorry, I need to leave. Thank you. Oops, sorry, poor lady. And now we're going to, again, align the border on the very same way. I'm going to align it with the edge of the border. At this point here, I'm going to grab my seam. I'm going to put my pin there because it's going to hold that seam better. It's not going to jiggle as much as it does there. Align my quarters. Align my quarters. Again, I mark that seam because I find it just holds a little bit better there. I can put in a couple more pins and I'm ready to sew. So that's my first border. I'm going to do exactly the same thing for my second border or any more borders that I'm going to put on the quilt. I'm going to first do the sides, quarter them, pin them on, sew them, press towards the border, put on the top and the bottom. And that's it in borders. So once you have them done, everything's going to look wonderfully flat. You're going to be so much happier with the way it hangs off your bed, whether it's a wall hanging or a table runner is going to lay flat on the table, hang nice and straight on the wall. And that is the proper way to do borders. So I think that's it for today. And unless there's any questions or anything, like I said, I know for a fact my quilt will not be I can use to demo putting borders on. And I'm sure there's something in the store, so I don't have to ask if anybody has anything to do. Oh, I am sure that there's stuff to do in the stores that needs borders.
Janet Spittle says it has been a very educational 15 weeks. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. I've enjoyed myself. So, yeah. So again, subscribe and like to my YouTube. What you've seen in the we touched for a second on mitered borders. I have a very extensive video on there on how to put on a mitered border. It's another process. And do have a quilt that needs a mitered border. Usually they have like a border print or a stripe. Check it out. I think you'll be very pleased on how it turns out. It's a little more innovative than the old school way of putting on a mitered. So, thank you, and we will see you next Monday for binding. In the meantime, happy quilting.